Welcome everyone to this fifth webinar in the series. I'm going to be discussing editorial considerations in reviews that include network meta-analysis. So I'm going to go through what editorial support is available for reviews of network meta-analysis, and then I'm going to touch on the protocol template that some of you may be aware of. And we've come up with some editorial guiding questions for reviews with network meta-analysis. And then we're going to go talk about when a network meta-analysis is planned but not feasible, and then show some resources and reference that we think could be useful. So for any Cochrane protocol or review that includes network meta-analysis, CRGs should seek methodological or statistical input in the peer review process from their associate editors. This support can be sought at any stage of the process, but the earlier the better. So whenever fits in with your particular review group's editorial process. The associate editors can then consult with us at the Method Support Unit and other sources of advice as necessary. So the Method Support Unit has been set up to support the associate editors and in turn the CRGs with methodological and statistical support. So in the past 6 months, we have been seeing a lot of protocols and reviews that are now included in network meta-analysis, and we are providing peer review comments on those. Because of this, because we're seeing a lot more sort of traffic in network meta-analysis, we have decided that it'd be a good idea, along with one of the support fellows, Audrey Tan, to create protocol guidance for authors and for CRGs as well. And this isn't a cut and paste template, so it hasn't got exact wording of what you should include. It's more guidance of what you should think about within each section of the protocol, so that to make sure that nothing is missed. And this is almost finalised now, so hopefully we will be able to make this widely available. So we've come up with a list of guiding questions to help editors when reviewing network meta-analysis. And this can also help authors as well, because the authors can obviously see what we're looking for to be included in each particular section. And answering no to any of the questions that we go through doesn't actually automatically mean that authors have made an error. It's just perhaps a bit of a red flag that we need to look into that in more detail, or an experienced statistician needs to be consulted to look at those details. It's important that Messier is still applied to all sections of the review, but we are working on an update, an extension to Messier for network meta-analysis. So these are the guiding questions that we're going to go through one by one, and it just, it starts with the author team and the background and goes through the different sections of the review, asking particular questions. So we're going to go through those questions one by one, and obviously this webinar will be made available afterwards, and we can hopefully continue work on the questions and make those available to people as well if people think that will be useful. So a lot of the examples within this come from this particular review: euthyrotonic agents for preventing postpartum hemorrhage and network meta-analysis, and we have referenced other particular examples throughout as well. So the first guiding question is regarding the author team. Does the author team include an experienced statistician with knowledge of network meta-analysis and clinician? So this can obviously be done by looking at the author list, as you can see here, and also the affiliations and looking at the contributions of authors as well. However, it may be difficult to know from just looking at this, especially experience with network meta-analysis. I mean, this may depend on the amount and the quality of reviews that those authors have published including network meta-analysis previously. So the rationale, it's important that the undertaking the network meta-analysis is justified. And we usually see that in the section in the background why it is important to do this review. So if we read through this section, and you can see here the highlighted text suggests that in the absence of a single randomized controlled trial comparing all available uterotonic agents, uncertainty remains over their relative effectiveness and ranking. So we conducted a network meta-analysis that's synthesizing all evidence. Appropriate rationales, according to the handbook, the comparing multiple interventions methods group were involved in writing that chapter of the handbook, state that availability of many independent comparisons is an appropriate rationale, absence of head-to-head comparisons, the need to resolve inconsistent findings, and the need to rank available treatment. The most important rationale is that the review addresses a question that involves multiple interventions. So as well as looking at why it is important to do a review, it's also important to check the background for indication that the transitivity assumption would not be violated. Transitivity is an important assumption that reviews, including network meta-analysis, need to consider, and that's that patients are equally likely to receive alternate treatments. So if you're looking at interventions A, B, and C in your review, it's important that the patients in one study that is looking at A and B, they could also have been randomized to intervention C if that particular study had included that intervention. So here it says the WHO recommends that all women giving birth should be offered uterotonics during the 3rd stage of labour for the prevention of PPH. It's important that the objective states that a network meta-analysis will be undertaken. So the question here, we ask that, is the research question clear, appropriate, and consistent with the title? So in the title, it should state a network meta-analysis after the title of the review. So this also should be included in the objective. And if ranking is to be undertaken within the review, that should also be included in the objective as well. So here you can see the highlighted text taken from the example I mentioned previously. It says to generate a clinically useful ranking of all available uterotonics. However, this particular review didn't include conducting a network meta-analysis in its objective, which it should have done. So the next question is, have the authors considered the transitivity assumption? And I've already briefly mentioned this on a previous slide. And this is, we look for this under the criteria for considering studies for this review. So under the types of interventions, types of participants, it's important that the authors have given the transitivity assumption some thought. So here you can see, it says for this review, we assume that any woman who meets the inclusion criteria is, in principle, equally likely to be randomized to any of the eligible uterotonic drugs. So that's what I was talking about before, that the women in any of the studies could have theoretically been randomized to any of the particular interventions. So we say that we need to clarify that the patients are equally likely to receive the alternative treatments. We need to check the number of interventions and the comparisons. So is it large enough so that the review is comprehensive and actually answers the question of the review? But is it small enough so that the review is clinically meaningful and readable as well? So this is obviously a difficult balance to take within a review of network meta-analysis. We also need to look at whether a decision on lumping or splitting the nodes of a network should be formed on the basis of the research question of the review and the outcomes of interest. So, for example, will different doses be combined or will they all be separated? And we also need to think about unspecified interventions as well. So with the clinical expertise in the team, the author team, we would hope that most of the interventions would be included in this section. However, when the search is actually undertaken, it may be that some other interventions that perhaps may be a more rare or not well known may be identified. So we need to think about how they will be dealt with in the review as well. Will they be included? And if this is a post hoc inclusion, it should be stated in the differences between the protocol and the review section of the review. For people who want more details on transitivity, obviously this is an important issue within a review of network meta-analysis. The recordings of the previous webinars have been made available online, and we do include a link at the end of this presentation, and they do go through the assumptions and the theory in more detail in those. But for those of you who have access to the Cochrane Handbook, section 11.2.2 gives a good definition of transitivity and a good explanation. It says it's closely related to it's a bit like the clinical diversity and statistical heterogeneity in a pairwise meta-analysis, and I think that helps think about how this applies to reviews of network meta-analysis, because I think transitivity is something a lot of people struggle with. The next question was data extracted on both outcome data and effect modifiers? So here you can see under data extraction and management, we've got subheadings, which is very helpful and makes it a bit easier to read. So we've got a subheading on outcome data and data on potential effect modifiers as well. And effect modifiers are important for checking the transitivity assumption as well. So we need to make sure that different clinical characteristics are balanced across the studies, and it's important to think about those while you're writing the review protocol to include in the protocol. So, for example, if one study is full of older participants and another study is all children, the transitivity assumption may be violated in that case, because the effect modifiers of age is different across the studies as well. So that's another important consideration. The next question is, are there separate subheadings for relative treatment effects and relative treatment ranking? And this comes under measures of treatment effect. So here you can see there's separate subheadings again. And then, as normal in a review that includes pairwise meta-analysis, they mention that they use risk ratios and mean difference with 95% confidence intervals. And then there's a section on relative treatment ranking as well. So it's important to ensure that an appropriate method has been included there. So it says surface under the cumulative ranking curve sucra. So that's an appropriate method to use for ranking. Sometimes we do see this under the data synthesis section as well. So it may be useful to know that even if it's not under measures of treatment effect, as long as it's there, either under this section or data synthesis, then that's probably okay. So for heterogeneity, is there a plan for assessing across treatment comparisons? So it's important to assess transitivity across treatment comparisons. And as you can see, the highlighted text here suggests the assumption of transitivity was evaluated epidemiologically by comparing the clinical and methodological characteristics of sets of studies from the various treatment comparisons. So for data synthesis, is there a plan for both pairwise meta-analysis and network meta-analysis? This section can often be quite long, so it is really useful to have subheadings in this section as well. So here you can see in the example, it says methods for direct treatment comparisons, and then what they did for pairwise meta-analysis, and then methods for indirect and mixed comparisons. Mixed comparisons is another name for network meta-analysis. So you can see here we perform the network meta-analysis with a frequentist framework using multivariate meta-analysis estimated by restricted maximum likelihood. So in terms of data synthesis, it's important for them to specify the statistical model to fit the network meta-analysis, Bayesian or frequentist. As you can see, they've done that here. They've said they're going to use a frequentist framework. Whether they're going to use fixed or random effects, they haven't specifically stated it in this section, but they do say in the pairwise that they've used random effects model. So you would assume that that's what they're doing here as well, but it would be good for them to explicitly state that. And also whether they're going to use multivariate meta-analysis or a hierarchical model. And as you can see here, they said they'd use multivariate meta-analysis. It's important that they also state if they account for the correlated nature of multi-arm studies. So some studies may include 3 arms, for example, and it's important to note whether the model that they are using takes this into consideration. So sometimes this is included under data synthesis, and sometimes we see it under the unit of analysis section as well, because obviously that section deals with multi-arm studies. So it's important that they've at least given that some thought. It's also important that assumptions about the heterogeneity, variance, and the method for estimating it should be reported as well. The Comparing Multiple Interventions Methods Group recommends 3 software packages for network meta-analysis: Stata, R, and Bayesian approaches using Winbugs, for example. If a Bayesian framework is to be used, there is additional technical details that are needed, such as which prior distributions will be used, and the convergence of Markov chain Monte Carlo approaches should also be described. It's important that the authors state which outcomes they will be undertaking network meta-analysis for. So we see this missing quite a lot, and as you can see, it doesn't actually say in this particular example which outcomes they will be undertaking network meta-analysis for. Is it just the primary outcomes? Is it all outcomes? So that obviously also needs some thought. The next question is, was statistical incoherence assessed both globally and locally? You may see incoherence referred to as inconsistency as well, but the handbook's tried to move away from that because it doesn't want to get people mixed up with inconsistency in terms of grade. But in the literature, they are used interchangeably in incoherence and inconsistency. So as you can see here, the highlighted text says that the design by treatment interaction model is, as described by Higgins et al. Is used. So this is known as a global approach. So that assesses the incoherence, so the difference between the direct and indirect estimates in the whole network. And they also state that we note that the confidence intervals for both the network meta-analysis and direct evidence were overlapping across all comparisons, suggesting locally consistent results except for ergometrine versus placebo or no treatment based on a single study. So they've also looked at local approaches as well. So as well as the information in the method section, which is obviously important for both the protocol and the full review. It's important that it's discussed in the results as well. And the handbook recommends that people should look at local approaches and global approaches. So local approaches is just looking at different different loops, whereas the global approach is looking at the whole network. And if you do want more information on incoherence, section 11.4.4.4 of the handbook provides a good explanation as well. And then we come on to the assessment of reporting biases. Have the authors constructed a comparison adjusted funnel plot? So we don't actually see this very often. People haven't tended to use comparison adjusted funnel plots yet, but here is one example. It's from a different review. It wasn't the review that we originally mentioned. It was Interventions for Unexplained Infertility, a systematic review and network meta-analysis. And as you can see, all of the different colours represent different comparisons. But it's important to note that, like with any funnel plot, there are multiple reasons for the asymmetry, so we need to be cautious on the interpretation of those. Okay, so I've run through a lot of the methods that the different sections and the methods that we look at, and we do this for both protocols and the full reviews. So these first set of slides are useful for both, and if there is any differences between the protocol and the full review, obviously it's important to note those changes in the differences between protocol and review section as well. And we've presented some examples so far that we think represent good practice in the reviews for the particular issues that we've discussed, but we are looking at collating good practice examples for all of these and trying to find more so we can make them more widely available so people can see what they should be looking for.